March 17, 1884. St. Patrick's Day. The workers at Midleton Distillery in County Cork, Ireland gathered around fermentation vat number 7 with growing horror. The sweet, yeasty smell that should have filled the air was overpowered by something else. Something wrong. Master distiller James McCarthy lifted his lantern over the vat's edge. The golden liquid that would become premium Irish whiskey reflected the light back at him. But there, suspended in 2,000 gallons of fermenting mash, was the bloated corpse of the distillery's mouser, a large tabby cat that had been missing for 3 days. The cat had drowned in the vat. Its body had been steeping in the alcohol like a grotesque tea bag. And this vat's contaminated contents had already been mixed into 500 barrels of whiskey. Whiskey that was now aging in the cellars. Whiskey that was worth a fortune. McCarthy's hands trembled as he lowered the lantern. He knew what had to be done, but he also knew what it would cost. But the truth was far more terrifying than a simple accident. Because within 6 weeks, 3 men connected to that cursed batch would be dead. And the whiskey? It would disappear into history, never to be accounted for. Before we uncover the truth about the Midleton Distillery cat and the cursed whiskey that may have killed 3 men, make sure to subscribe to Fear's Sermon and ring that notification bell. We're diving deep into one of Ireland's darkest industrial secrets, a story the distillery tried to bury for over a century. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers, especially those of you in Ireland who might have heard whispers of this tale. Now, let's return to March 1884, when death contaminated Ireland's most prestigious distillery. Ireland in 1884 existed under the shadow of British rule, still recovering from the devastation of the Great Famine that had ravaged the island 4 decades earlier. The population had been halved through starvation, disease, and mass emigration. Those who remained carried the trauma in their bones. But Irish whiskey? Irish whiskey was thriving. The Midleton Distillery, established in 1825 in County Cork, had become one of the crown jewels of Irish distilling. Its 3 massive pot stills, the largest in the world at the time, could produce over 2 million gallons of whiskey annually. The old Midleton Distillery, as it would later be known, employed over 200 men from the surrounding villages. For many families, a job at Midleton meant the difference between survival and emigration to America. The distillery complex sprawled across several acres, malting floors where barley was spread and turned, mashing rooms where grain was converted to sugar, fermentation halls lined with massive wooden vats, each holding thousands of gallons of liquid in various stages of becoming whiskey. And below everything, the cellars, cool, dark, and filled with thousands of oak barrels aging their precious contents. The work was hot, dangerous, and intoxicating. The air itself was alcoholic. Men worked 12-hour shifts in temperatures that could exceed 100 degrees near the stills. Accidents were common: burns, falls, alcohol poisoning from the fumes. But there were rules. Sacred rules. Cleanliness was paramount. Any contamination could ruin an entire batch, could poison someone who drank it, could shut down the entire operation if discovered by the British excise officers who monitored every drop produced. This is why the distillery kept cats. Dozens of them prowled the facility, hunting the rats that were attracted to the grain stores. The cats were working animals, semi-feral, tolerated but not beloved. They slept where they wished. They went where they pleased. And sometimes, drawn by the sweet smell of fermentation, they got too close to the vats. The tabby cat that would change everything was simply known as Big Tom to the workers. He was larger than most, battle-scarred from fights, and utterly fearless. He'd been at the distillery for at least 5 years, a veteran mouser who'd earned his keep many times over. But Big Tom had a habit. He liked to walk the narrow railings that surrounded the fermentation vats, hunting for the moths that were drawn to the light and warmth. Workers had seen him up there countless times, balancing on wood barely 6 inches wide, suspended over thousands of gallons of liquid that could drown a man in minutes. No one thought to stop him. No one thought he could fall. Until the morning of March 14, 1884, when Big Tom simply vanished. The first sign something was wrong came from John Brennan, a 28-year-old fermentation worker who'd been employed at Midleton for 6 years. On the morning of March 15th, Brennan approached his supervisor with an unusual complaint. "The mash in vat 7 smells wrong," he reported. "Sweet still, but there's something under it. Something off." The supervisor, Patrick O'Sullivan, made a note but didn't investigate immediately. Fermentation was an imperfect science in 1884. Sometimes a batch would develop unusual aromas. Sometimes wild yeasts would contaminate the process, creating unexpected flavors. It happened. The important thing was whether the alcohol content was correct and whether the liquid was clear. Vat 7 was checked. The alcohol content was precisely where it should be. The liquid appeared clear. O'Sullivan marked it as acceptable, and the fermentation continued. But Brennan couldn't shake his unease. He mentioned it to other workers during their lunch break in the courtyard. Several men who'd worked near Vat 7 agreed. There was something different about this batch. The smell wasn't quite right. The foam on top of the liquid had a different color, almost grayish rather than the usual cream. "Maybe we got some bad barley in the mash," suggested Thomas Fitzgerald, a malting floor worker. "I've seen moldy grain give off strange smells." The men nodded. It made sense. They returned to work. That same afternoon, James McCarthy, the master distiller, received a visit from the distillery's owner, James Murphy. Murphy was a wealthy businessman who rarely involved himself in daily operations, but he'd heard whispers that something was off with one of the fermentation batches. "I need this sorted, James," Murphy said, standing in McCarthy's cramped office overlooking the fermentation hall. "We've got orders backing up. I can't afford to lose product over some workers' superstitions." McCarthy assured him everything was under control. The batch had been tested. It met all specifications. It would be distilled within the week. But that night, McCarthy couldn't sleep. Something gnawed at him. He'd been distilling whiskey for 23 years. He knew the smell of fermenting mash the way a mother knows her child's cry. And Vat 7 didn't smell right. On March 16th, McCarthy ordered the vat drained early. Better safe than sorry. The liquid would be pumped into the pot stills and distilled, separating the alcohol from the water and impurities through heat and condensation. Whatever was causing the odd smell would be eliminated in the process. At least, that's what McCarthy told himself. The distillation took 8 hours. The resulting spirit was tested by nosing, the traditional method where the distiller would smell the alcohol to assess its quality. McCarthy himself performed this test, pouring a small amount into a glass and holding it up to his nose. The smell was clean, pure, perfect. He breathed a sigh of relief. Whatever contamination might have occurred during fermentation had been eliminated. The whiskey was safe, but McCarthy made one critical error. He never looked inside the vat itself. The next morning, St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1884, the fermentation hall was scheduled for its monthly deep cleaning. This meant draining any remaining liquid from the vats and physically climbing inside to scrub the wooden walls with brushes and hot water. John Brennan drew the assignment for Vat 7. He approached it with a sense of vindication. He'd been right that something was wrong. Now he'd find out what, probably mold on the wooden staves. Maybe some dead rats had gotten into the grain before it was mashed. Nothing catastrophic, just proof he had good instincts. Brennan positioned the ladder against the vat's rim and climbed up to look inside. The vat had been drained during distillation, but there was always residual liquid at the bottom, maybe 50 gallons that the pumps couldn't reach. This sediment would be particularly thick, full of dead yeast cells and grain particles. Brennan lifted his lantern over the edge, and there, half submerged in the golden-brown sludge at the bottom of the vat, was Big Tom. The cat's body was grotesquely swollen, its fur matted and slick with fermented mash. Its eyes were gone, dissolved or eaten away. Its mouth hung open in what looked like a silent scream. The body had been steeping in the alcohol for 3 full days, the tissues breaking down, leaching into the liquid, becoming part of it. Brennan's scream brought every worker in the fermentation hall running. Within minutes, Master Distiller McCarthy was there, staring down at the contaminated vat with a face gone pale as death itself. Patrick O'Sullivan stood beside him, gripping the railing so hard his knuckles had turned white. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," O'Sullivan whispered. "How long has it been in there?" McCarthy's mind was racing, calculating, remembering. 3 days. It's been missing 3 days. "The distillation," Brennan said from beside them, his voice shaking. "Sir, we already distilled this batch." McCarthy nodded slowly. "Wednesday last, 8 hours and still number 2. But the men looked at each other. The contaminated liquid had already been converted to whiskey, high-proof pure whiskey that was now filling in oak barrels in the cellars below. And because of the distillery's blending process, that single batch, roughly 450 gallons of spirit, had already been mixed into the standard production run. 500 barrels, each containing 50 gallons, 25,000 gallons of whiskey, all potentially contaminated with trace amounts of dissolved cat. The silence stretched out. broken only by the drip of condensation from the copper pipes overhead. Finally, McCarthy spoke. "No one says a word about this, not to anyone. We need to think." But it was already too late. 20 workers had seen the body. And in a small Irish village where the distillery was the center of everything, secrets didn't stay secret for long. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button. We're about to uncover what the distillery tried to do with 500 barrels of contaminated whiskey, and why 3 men ended up dead. Share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. Let's discover what happens next. The emergency meeting convened in the distillery's main office at 8 o'clock that evening. Present were James Murphy, the owner, James McCarthy, the master distiller, Patrick O'Sullivan, the fermentation supervisor, and 3 members of the distillery's board of directors. Also present, though not officially invited, was Dr. William Harrington, the local physician who served as the distillery's medical officer. Someone, probably O'Sullivan, had sent for him, understanding that this was more than a business problem. This was a public health crisis. The minutes of this meeting were destroyed. We know they existed because several attendees referenced them in later correspondence, but the actual document disappeared from the distillery's archives sometime before 1900. However, through letters, diary entries, and testimony given years later, we can reconstruct what was discussed. Dr. Harrington spoke first. He'd examined the cat's remains, which had been removed from the vat and placed in a sealed container. His assessment was grim. The body showed advanced decomposition accelerated by the alcohol. Tissue breakdown had been extensive. The cat's internal organs had essentially liquefied over the 3-day steeping period. Blood, bile, digestive contents, and dissolved tissue had leached into the fermented mash. Then came the distillation process. Heat kills bacteria and parasites, which was in the distillery's favor. The alcohol concentration, at least 40% after distillation, would also inhibit microbial growth. But the chemical compounds from the decomposition? Those would have remained in the liquid, would have been carried through the distillation process, would have been present in trace amounts in the finished whiskey. Would it kill someone? Murphy asked, leaning forward in his chair. Dr. Harrington paused. Unlikely. The concentration would be extremely low, diluted across 500 barrels, perhaps harmless, perhaps. McCarthy jumped on the word. "I cannot say with certainty," Dr. Harrington admitted. "This is unprecedented. I know of no medical literature on the effects of consuming alcohol contaminated with decomposed animal matter. The alcohol itself might have neutralized any harmful compounds, or it might have preserved them. I simply cannot say." The room fell silent. They were facing an impossible choice. Option 1, destroy 500 barrels of whiskey. At 40 shillings per barrel wholesale, that was a loss of 1,000 pounds sterling, equivalent to roughly 150,000 pounds in today's money. The financial hit would be devastating. Jobs would be lost. The distillery might not recover. Option 2, say nothing. The contamination was likely harmless. The alcohol content would kill any bacteria. The trace amounts of decomposed cat were probably so diluted as to be meaningless. Thousands of people had drunk worse from polluted wells and survived. This was probably safe, probably. James Murphy, the owner, made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We've done the distillation. The doctor says it's probably safe. The whiskey meets all quality standards. We have no scientific proof it's harmful." He looked around the room at each man in turn. "Those barrels continue aging. We bottle on schedule, and none of this ever happened." McCarthy started to object, but Murphy cut him off. "The business cannot survive this loss, James. 200 families depend on this distillery. We lose 1,000 pounds, we start laying off workers. Is that what you want? Men out of work because of a dead cat?" The logic was brutal but effective. In 1884 Ireland, unemployed men meant starving families. It meant emigration. It meant the slow death of the village that had grown up around the distillery. One by one, the men agreed. The whiskey would be sold. But Dr. Harrington insisted on one condition: they would track the batch. Every barrel from the contaminated production run would be marked with a small notch on the bottom of the barrel head, invisible to customers but identifiable to anyone who knew to look. If anyone reported illness or death connected to Midleton whiskey in the coming months, they'd be able to identify if it came from the contaminated batch. It was a compromise between conscience and profit, and everyone in that room convinced themselves it was enough. The meeting adjourned at midnight. The men filed out into the cold March air, each carrying the weight of a decision that might cost lives. What none of them knew What they couldn't have known was that the whiskey had already begun to kill. The first death occurred on April 2, 1884, 16 days after the cat's discovery. John Brennan, the fermentation worker who'd found Big Tom's body, collapsed at work. He'd been complaining of severe stomach pain for 2 days, dismissing it as indigestion. But that morning, as he climbed the ladder to check a fermentation vat, he doubled over, vomited blood, and fell 15 feet to the stone floor below. He died 3 hours later in his home, attended by Dr. Harrington, who could do nothing but administer laudanum for the pain. Brennan's wife and 3 children watched him die, his abdomen swollen and rigid, his skin turning yellow as his liver failed. The official cause of death, accidental poisoning, likely from industrial exposure to methanol fumes. It was plausible. Methanol, wood alcohol, was a known hazard in distilleries. Brennan had worked around alcohol vapor for 6 years. The explanation satisfied the authorities, but Dr. Harrington knew better. He'd seen methanol poisoning before. This wasn't it. Brennan's symptoms, acute gastric distress, liver failure, the rapidity of onset, suggested something else. Something toxic he'd ingested. Harrington went to James McCarthy privately. "Did Brennan drink any of the whiskey from that batch?" Burr McCarthy's face went pale. "Jesus Christ, I don't know. The workers, they sometimes sample from the barrels. Just a taste to check the aging. It's against rules, but everyone does it." "Burr, which barrels would he have access to?" Burr McCarthy closed his eyes. "All of them. He worked in that section of the cellar twice a week." "Burr, the second death came on April 19th. Patrick O'Sullivan, the fermentation supervisor who'd been present at the contamination meeting, died in his sleep. His wife found him in the morning, cold in their bed, his lips blue, his face frozen in what she described as an expression of absolute terror. The official cause of death, heart failure. O'Sullivan was 42 years old and had been in perfect health. Dr. Harrington performed an informal examination of the body before burial. He found signs consistent with acute poisoning, petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes, abnormal discoloration of the internal organs. But without a formal autopsy, and without the authority to demand one, he couldn't prove anything. 2 men dead, both present when the cat was discovered, both with access to the contaminated whiskey. Harrington returned to the distillery and demanded another meeting. This time only Murphy and McCarthy attended. The 3 men sat in Murphy's office as evening fell, the room illuminated by a single oil lamp. "The whiskey is killing them," Harrington said without preamble. "I don't know how and I don't know the mechanism, but those men died from something they ingested, and the only thing they both had access to was your contaminated batch." Beer Murphy slammed his hand on the desk. "You have no proof. Brennan fell from a ladder. O'Sullivan had a bad heart." Burr O'Sullivan's heart was fine. I'd examined him 3 months prior, and Brennan's symptoms were consistent with toxic ingestion, not methanol exposure. Beer consistent with, but not proof. McCarthy spoke up, his voice quiet. "What about the workers? If the whiskey is poisoned, what about the men in the cellars? What about the customers who'll eventually drink it?" Murphy stood, walked to the window, stared out at the darkened distillery complex. "We don't know the whiskey did this. We have 2 dead men and a theory. That's all." "They are, then let me test it," Harrington said. "Give me a sample from one of the marked barrels. Let me have it analyzed properly in Dublin. If it's safe, we continue. If it's not, we destroy the batch." Burr, the silence stretched out. Finally, Murphy turned from the window. "No, we've committed to this course. Testing now would create evidence that could destroy us. If word got out that we even suspected the whiskey was poisoned." He shook his head. "The distillery would be finished. All 200 workers would be unemployed. Is that what you want?" Burr, it was the same argument he'd made before. And once again it worked. Because Murphy was right. Exposing the contamination would destroy the distillery just as surely as the contamination itself. Dr. Harrington left the meeting, defeated. He'd tried. He'd warned them. But he had no authority to force the issue. And in 1884, a rural doctor had no way to compel a wealthy businessman to destroy his own product based on suspicion alone. The third death occurred on May 7, 1884. James McCarthy, master distiller, age 48, was found dead in the fermentation hall at 6 o'clock in the morning. He was lying face down beside vat 7, the same vat where Big Tom had drowned. An empty whiskey bottle lay beside him. Analysis would later show it contained whiskey from the contaminated batch. The official ruling was suicide by alcohol poisoning. McCarthy had drunk himself to death, overcome by guilt and grief over the 2 workers who'd died. It was a tragedy, everyone agreed, but understandable. The man had blamed himself. Dr. Harrington didn't attend the funeral. He couldn't stomach the hypocrisy. But he did one thing. He wrote everything down, the contamination, the meeting, the deaths, his suspicions, in a detailed letter that he sealed and gave to his solicitor with instructions that it not be opened unless there were more deaths connected to the distillery. Then he waited for reports of illness from customers who'd purchased Midleton whiskey, waited for more workers to die, waited for the catastrophe he was certain was coming, but it never did. No more distillery workers died. No reports of illness came from pubs or customers. The 500 barrels continued aging in the cellars, indistinguishable from every other barrel except for that small notch on the bottom. And slowly, Dr. Harrington began to doubt himself. Maybe it had been coincidence. Maybe the men died of natural causes that just happened to cluster together. Maybe the whiskey was safe after all. In 1887, 3 years after the contamination, the first barrels from that batch were bottled and sold. The whiskey went to pubs across Ireland and was shipped to England, Scotland, and America. Thousands of people drank it over the next decade. None reported illness. None died mysteriously. The whiskey was, by all measurable standards, completely safe. So what killed those 3 men? The mystery of Midleton's contaminated whiskey raises questions that resonate far beyond 1 dead cat and 3 dead men. It exposes the fundamental tension between profit and safety that defined industrial food production in the 19th century, and arguably still defines it today. In 1884, there were no food safety regulations in Ireland or Britain, no inspection agencies, no legal requirement to report contamination. The Pure Food and Drug Act wouldn't pass in the United States until 1906. British food safety legislation didn't come until 1928. For decades, manufacturers operated in a regulatory vacuum, where the only constraint was their own conscience. The Midleton case was far from unique. Historical records reveal numerous incidents of food and beverage contamination that were simply covered up. In 1858, Bradford, England, a confectioner accidentally poisoned 200 people, killing 21, by using arsenic instead of plaster of Paris in his peppermint candy. The incident was public because the deaths were immediate and traceable. But what about the contaminations that weren't immediately lethal? What about the slow poisonings, the trace contaminations, the batches that might or might not have caused harm? We'll never know how many there were. Because without regulations requiring disclosure, most incidents were simply buried. The question of what actually killed Brennan, O'Sullivan, and McCarthy remains genuinely mysterious. Dr. Harrington's letter, which was eventually opened in 1923 and deposited in the Cork County Archives, offers several theories. Theory 1, the whiskey genuinely was poisoned. Decomposition produced toxic compounds that survived distillation. The 3 men died because they consumed higher concentrations than regular customers would, workers sampling directly from barrels rather than diluted servings in pubs. This would explain why no customers reported illness, while the workers died. Theory 2, the deaths were coincidental. Brennan's fall might have been genuinely accidental. O'Sullivan might have had an undiagnosed heart condition. McCarthy might have committed suicide from guilt. The clustering was bad luck, not causation. Theory 3, the darkest possibility. McCarthy poisoned the other 2 men to silence them, then killed himself from guilt. This theory is supported by the fact that McCarthy had access to industrial chemicals, including methanol and other toxins. It's also supported by the curious fact that he died beside the vat where it all started. Perhaps a symbolic gesture. We'll never know with certainty. The bodies weren't preserved for modern analysis. The whiskey barrels, all 500 of them, were consumed by 1897. The distillery's records were carefully edited to remove any mention of the incident. But the Midleton contamination did have one lasting impact. It contributed to growing pressure for food safety regulation. Dr. Harrington's letter, though not publicly released until decades later, was shared with public health officials in Cork. It became part of a larger file of contamination incidents that Irish medical professionals used to argue for regulation. When Ireland eventually passed its first food safety legislation in 1936, incidents like Midleton were part of the justification. The law required disclosure of known contaminations, required testing, required proof of safety before sale. Too late for Brennan, O'Sullivan, and McCarthy. Too late for whoever else might have been harmed by that cursed batch of whiskey. But perhaps their deaths meant something after all. The old Midleton Distillery continued production until 1975, when it was replaced by a modern facility nearby. The original buildings are now a museum where tourists can see those massive copper pot stills and walk through the fermentation halls, where Big Tom drowned in 1884. The tour guides don't mention the cat, don't mention the contamination, don't mention the 3 dead men. It's not part of the official history, just like it wasn't part of the official records in 1884. But in the village of Midleton, among the descendants of those distillery workers, the story survived. Whispered from grandparent to grandchild, a cautionary tale about secrets and consequences, about profit and death, and about how a dead cat contaminated not just 500 barrels of whiskey, but also the conscience of everyone who decided that money mattered more than truth. What do you think really happened at Midleton Distillery? Was the whiskey genuinely poisoned, killing the 3 men? Were their deaths tragic coincidences? Or did Master Distiller Mac Carthy commit murder to cover up the contamination, then take his own life from guilt? Leave your theories in the comments below. And if you're from Ireland, especially from County Cork, let us know if you've heard local stories about the distillery that never made it into the official history. This is the kind of historical mystery we uncover here at Fear Sermon, the dark chapters that industries tried to erase from the record. The stories that reveal uncomfortable truths about the past and the present. Subscribe for more lost chapters of history that the powerful wanted forgotten. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation into the shadows of the past. And remember, every bottle of whiskey you drink has a history. Most of those histories are just better hidden than the cat in Vat 7. See you in the next video.